A few years ago, I made a video called Do I Have a Voice for Audiobook Narration? And funny enough, out of all the videos I've put out on this channel, that one continues to be one of the most watched videos. So apparently, there are a whole lot of you out there wondering the same thing. Do I have the right voice to narrate audiobooks? Well, a lot has happened since I made that video. So at this point, I've narrated more than 450 audiobooks. I've done everything from children's books and memoirs to fantasy, lit RPG, romance, you name it. I've done it. And over 1,000 hours of audio dramas. And after all of that, my answer to this question has actually changed a little. Because now I think, do I have the right voice? Might actually be the wrong question. Let me explain. When people first think about audiobook narration, I think a lot of us have this picture in our head of what an audiobook narrator is supposed to sound like. Maybe you think you need this really smooth, rich, beautiful voice, or a deep voice, or a very, very polished voice, right? Or maybe somebody's told you your whole life you have such a beautiful voice, you should do voiceover. And hey, that's great. But having a nice voice is definitely not what makes somebody a good audiobook narrator. It helps. Obviously, we're working with our voices. But storytelling is so much more important. When somebody listens to an audiobook, I don't really want them sitting there thinking, wow, Angela has a lovely voice. I want them to forget about me. I want them to be worried about the character. I want them to be angry with somebody, or I want them to laugh or cry. I want them to stay in the car for another 5 minutes because they need to know what happens next, right? That is the job. And that's one of the biggest things I've learned over the years. You don't have to sound like a radio announcer. Please don't. In fact, a lot of times you really shouldn't sound like a radio announcer. You need to sound like a person telling another person a really good story. And there's a huge difference. The second thing I think people underestimate is just how much acting is involved in audiobook narration, especially fiction. You're not just reading words off a page. You're figuring out what the character wants, what they're feeling, what they're trying not to say. Maybe the words on the page say, I'm fine. Simple, right? Well, let's see. Let's look at it 3 different ways. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. Those can be 3 completely different moments in a story, right? That's just 2 little words, silly example. But that's acting. It isn't necessarily about coming up with some crazy character voice, which, you know, I love. It's understanding what is happening in that moment and then letting the listener hear it or feel it. And this is something I've learned even more from doing audio drama, because when you're working on a story for hundreds of episodes, you really start thinking about character intention and emotional continuity. You're asking yourself things like, where was this character emotionally in the last scene? What's happening now? What are they trying to get from the other person? And all of that comes through your voice. So if you're sitting there wondering whether your voice is pretty enough, I wouldn't spend too much time worrying about that. I'd be asking, can I tell a story? Can I connect to what I'm reading? Can I make somebody else care about these characters? Because that matters so much more. Now, here's something else nobody really understands until they start doing this. Narrating a 5-minute sample and narrating a 10-hour audiobook are 2 very different things. You might record an audiobook and think, wow. Not an audiobook. You might record an audition and think, oh, that was awesome, right? Now, do it for 5 hours. And then come back tomorrow and sound exactly the same. And remember how you voiced Bob in Chapter 2 when he's going to pop back up in Chapter 28, remember what he sounded like. Or remember how Sarah speaks quickly or slowly. Remember that another character has a southern accent, but not too southern, right? Remember how you pronounce that fantasy city with 17 consonants in it. That's audiobook narration. Consistency becomes a huge part of the job. And then there's stamina. You can build up to this, don't worry, but this is long-form narration. You're not recording a 30-second commercial. You're living with these books for days, weeks, and if you're narrating a series, you might be living with these characters for years. So another question I would ask yourself is, do I actually enjoy reading out loud for long periods of time? Because I know that sounds incredibly obvious, but you'd be surprised. I love it. I really do. I love disappearing into a story. But there are absolutely days when my mouth doesn't want to cooperate, my brain stops recognizing English, and I think I've read the same sentence for 6 times. Every narrator knows exactly what I'm talking about, right? The other thing that has changed for me since my first video is that I've gotten a much bigger look at what happens on the production side of audiobooks. And that has really changed the way I think about being a professional narrator. Because being good in front of the microphone is only part of it. You also have to know how to work. You need to be able to take direction. You need to be consistent. You need to respect and research pronunciations. You need to keep track of characters. You need to communicate with producers. You need to know how to handle pickups when something needs to be corrected. And depending on who you're working with, you may need to know things like punch and roll and how to actually deliver your recordings properly. I'm actually going to do separate videos about some of this because there's way too much to talk about here, especially punch and roll. If you're starting to move toward publisher work, that's definitely something you're going to want to understand, though. I also want to do a video about maybe actually what happens to your audiobook after you finish recording it, because since I've been doing post-production work, it's a really cool aspect, something you should learn. I've sat now on the other side, listening to narrators' recordings, creating pickup lists, inserting corrections, and I'll tell you, you learn a lot about narration when you're the person listening for all the little things that need to be fixed. So we'll definitely talk about that. Now, let's talk about equipment for just a second, because this always comes up. You do need good audio, absolutely. But please don't take that to mean you need to go spend thousands of dollars on equipment tomorrow. Your recording space is incredibly important. Probably more important than the microphone you're using. You can have a really expensive microphone and still have terrible audio if you're recording in a room with reflections or traffic noise, your refrigerator kicking on, your dog barking, whatever it happens to be. So yes, eventually, if you're going to work professionally, you need a professional recording space. But if you're brand new, first find out if you actually like doing this. Learn, practice, practice, practice. And did I say practice? Listen to yourself. Get coaching if you can. That will save you so much time. Start understanding the craft before you start buying every piece of equipment somebody on YouTube tells you that you need, including me. So, going back to the original question, do you have the right voice for audiobook narration? Maybe. But I really don't think that's the question that's going to determine whether or not you're successful. A much better question is, are you willing to learn how to use the voice you already have? Can you tell a story? Can you act? Can you listen critically to your own work? Can you take direction without getting defensive? Can you sit in a booth for hours and still care about the story? Can you keep learning? Because I'm still learning. I have so much to learn. After more than 450 books, I'm absolutely still learning. Every project teaches me something. Every producer teaches me something. Every coaching session or class I take teaches me something. And sometimes a book comes along and teaches me that I apparently cannot pronounce a word I've been saying wrong my entire life. So if you've been sitting on the sidelines because you don't think you have that perfect audiobook voice, I wouldn't let that stop you. Work on the storytelling. Work on the acting. Work on the technical side. Learn the business. And then see where it takes you. Because audiobook narration really isn't about having the perfect voice. It's about learning what to do with the voice you have. If you're interested in becoming an audiobook narrator, I'm going to be doing several more videos about this because, well, there's just so much I want to talk about now that I've been doing this for a few more years. We'll talk about punch and roll. We'll talk about home studios, maybe. We'll talk about what actually happens after you record the book, maybe. We'll talk about getting work. And I'll probably share some of the things I wish I knew when I first got started. So if that's something you're interested in, subscribe and stick around. And I would really love to know this. If you're thinking about becoming an audiobook narrator, what is the one thing you're most confused or nervous about right now? Put it in the comments. Because chances are, if you're wondering about it, somebody else is too. And it might just become my next video.